Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today I will be ranking the best Sharks teams of this past decade. So this is from the 2010 playoffs to the 2019 playoffs, or the 09-10 season to the 18-19 season. Thus, it does not include this current, or whatever you want to call it, season that is currently on pause, which is, of course, the 1920 season. If it had been included, however, it would have likely found itself right at the bottom of the list in the 11th position. But instead, we'll be taking a look at the previous decade, and in that 10th place, it's pretty obvious. Honestly, the only year that the Sharks actually missed the playoffs during this 10-year stretch was, of course, the 14-15 season. As I said, I doubt there's any arguments for this one. It was a bit of a transition year for the Sharks. They were coming off having been reverse swept by the Kings. Doug Wilson decided to try and take, as he said, one step back to take two steps forward. It was Todd McLellan's final year as head coach for the Sharks. It was Antti Niemi's final year as starting goaltender for the Sharks, and it was just a pretty forgetful year all around for the Sharks. The only real thing that stands out is, of course, in the entry draft that season, the Sharks, because they missed the playoffs, had 9th overall and managed to get Timo Meier, who, as we know now, of course, very much helped the Sharks in the next coming years and will likely continue to help the Sharks into the future. So, as I said, forgetful year for the Sharks performance-wise, but nice to get Timo Meier at the end of it. I will say, though, that these last couple of seasons here, 10, 9, probably 8th as well as 1st and 2nd, there probably isn't going to be too much argument about which seasons land there, but really the majority of the argument will likely come from these seasons between 3rd and 7th, where there is a lot more fluidity of where they are placed. In 9th space, I will have the 11-12 season. This was a season in which, yes, the Sharks did make the playoff, but they weren't particularly competitive that year. They came 7th place in the Western Conference, which I should mention, there was a change in how the conferences worked during this decade. In the 11-12 season, it worked the old way, in which there were 3 divisions per conference. So in the Western Conference, there were 3 divisions of 5 teams, the Northwest, the Central, and the Pacific. The top team in each division would make it in the top 3 spots in the conference, and then the next 5 spots would just be points-wise. And so the Sharks, in the 11th-12th season, they ended up finding themselves 7th place in the Western Conference. They would face off against the St. Louis Blues in the first round, who had come 2nd place in the Western Conference. While they would win the first game of that series, they'd lose the next 4. It wasn't necessarily all that close in that series, and so it was, as was the 14th-15th season, a pretty forgetful year performance-wise for the Sharks, one that ended up being sort of sandwiched between some pretty successful seasons otherwise in the 09-10, 10-11, as well as 12-13 and onwards. So just a small blip on the radar, which is why it finds itself 9th in terms of seasons. In 8th place, another season with a first-round exit. That would be the 16-17 season, which it was a bit of a strange year because it was coming off of a year in which the Sharks made it to the Stanley Cup Finals. They came 3rd place in the Pacific Division in the regular season. They would face off against the Edmonton Oilers, who were a team that was making the playoffs for the first time in a long time. So it was an inexperienced team, and yet the Sharks actually played pretty poorly during that series. They had ended up losing it in 6 games, and that's why it finds itself here in the 8th spot, because while I think the Sharks were a better team than they played in that first series, it was just kind of disappointing to see them play all that poorly. I don't think the Oilers were necessarily that fantastic. I don't think they looked so great in that series, and that's why the Sharks really lagged behind, as will be the case for a lot of the series in front of this one. But it was just kind of a disappointing performance all around from the Sharks, which is why it finds itself in 8th. In 7th place, we will have the 17-18 season. So the season, of course, after the 16-17 season. This was a season in which the Sharks also finished 3rd place in the Pacific Division. They were a 100-point team in the regular season, which was nice to see. They faced off against the Ducks, and while it was predicted to be a close series, it was not close at all. The Sharks would get a sweep over the Ducks. 4 games, moving on, they'd face off against the first-year team Las Vegas Golden Knights, where they would end up losing in 6 games, and it seemed as though they were somewhat outmatched in that series. Even if they had won, would they have been able to take out the Jets? They probably wouldn't have been able to take out the Capitals in the Stanley Cup Finals. So the Sharks, while they were a pretty good team that year, and I'm sure a lot of the teams that have been missing the playoffs, a Coyotes or a Buffalo Sabres, would have killed to have a season like the Sharks did in 17-18. From Sharks' perspective, from Sharks standards, compared to other years that decade, it wasn't all that fantastic. They were good, but they weren't great. In the 6th spot, I actually have the controversial 13-14 season. I'm sure some people might even have this one further up in this list, but likely further down because of how the season ended. Of course, the Sharks faced off against the Kings in the first round, and while they took a 3-0 series lead, they would end up losing it in 7 games, getting reverse swept for only, the 4th time in NHL history, if I'm not mistaken, which was quite embarrassing, certainly. But you take a look at it from, an outside perspective, a few years removed now. It was a Sharks series against the Kings team, who of course were Stanley Cup champions in 2012, Western Conference finalists in 2013. They would eventually go on to win the Stanley Cup in that year as well. And so it was still a tough 7-game series against a very, very good Los Angeles Kings team. And honestly, even though the Sharks did drop out in the first round, you could very well make an argument that the Sharks were still maybe the 3rd best team in the Western Conference that year, only behind the Kings and likely behind the Blackhawks. And so while it was a bow out in the first round, the Sharks were still a pretty decent team. They obviously lose marks here for having been reverse swept, but if the situation had been slightly different and the Sharks just played a normal 7-game series in which they ended up losing, I feel like the perspective of this series would have been extremely different, and it might have been looked on as more of a favorable season. And it would have been interesting to see how Sharks history would have been altered, because if they had just lost normally in that first round, would have Doug Wilson have made the same decisions as he did going into the 14-15 season? Who knows? But it was still a decent Sharks team that year, and I do think it was ahead of those other 4 seasons. In 5th place now, I have the 09-10 season. The Sharks in the regular season were extremely successful that year. They would get first place in the Western Conference, 2nd place in the league, only behind the extremely successful Washington Capitals. They would go into the first round of the playoffs against the Avalanche. Small few bumps here or there against that team. Of course, the Dan Boyle own goal comes to mind, but handled them rather easily in 6 games. They'd go into that second series against the Red Wings, who at the moment are not a very good team at all in the present time, but at that time, for those who are maybe newer NHL fans, the Red Wings were very, very good. Of course, in 07-08, they won the Stanley Cup. In 08-09, they were Stanley Cup finalists, losing to the Pittsburgh Penguins, and so this was only 1 year removed from that dominance by the Red Wings, and so the Sharks managing to take them out in 5 games was extremely impressive. But then they faced off against a very good Blackhawk team in that Western Conference Finals. This was a Blackhawks team that was beginning to have prime Kane, prime Taves, prime Hjalmarsson, prime Keith, prime Seabrook, very, very stacked Blackhawks team, and the Sharks didn't really have much of a chance against them. They'd end up getting swept. It was likely a closer series than that, but not by all that much. You play that series multiple times over, and the Blackhawks probably win the majority of those chances, and so it was sort of the beginning of what ended up being a bit of a theme during this decade for the Sharks, in that they just were always, or almost always, a very good team, but never really were the best team in the league. So in this season in particular, they were just behind the Blackhawks, but you'll see as we go further up in this list, they always seem to be behind somebody for best team in the league. In 4th spot, I have the 12-13 season. A pretty successful season for the Sharks, all things considered. In that first round, they ended up getting their first sweep in franchise history, managing to take out the Vancouver Canucks in just the 4 games. Going into the second round, however, they would face off against the Los Angeles Kings. Of course, the Kings were coming off of a Stanley Cup victory in the previous year, and the Sharks played a very hard-fought series with them. It would end up going 7 games, with the home team winning each and every one. The Kings took an early 2-0 lead. The Sharks tied it up at 2. Then they exchanged games in games 5 and 6. So going into that one at home for the Kings, the Sharks were looking to break the curse. It was unable to be done. The Sharks would drop in 7 games before the Kings would end up losing in the Western Conference Finals to the eventual Cup champs Blackhawks. But the Sharks, honestly, you play that series multiple times, unlike in the previous year, the 09-10 season, where I said the Blackhawks likely win more often than not. The Sharks and the Kings probably trade victories in series like that, so it's possible that you play that series over again, and maybe the Sharks are the team that go on to face the Blackhawks, and who knows who wins at that point. Obviously, the Kings and the Blackhawks have very different styles of play, so maybe the Sharks would have matched up better against the Blackhawks. So It was also a tough series because, of course, game one, the Sharks had Raffi Torres get suspended for the entirety of the series. And while Raffi Torres isn't the most, beautiful of name that really jumps off the page as being such an effective forward, he was very good in the series against the Canucks previously. So maybe that could have also had something different if he doesn't get suspended there. But a lot of what ifs. The fact of the matter is that the Sharks were eliminated in the second round, but it was still a pretty good season all around for the Sharks. And a couple things go differently, and maybe we're singing a different tune here 7 years later. In third, I have the 10-11 season. So it was the second straight year where the Sharks actually managed to make it to the Western Conference Final. The 09-10 season, as I said, they bowed out in 4 games against the Blackhawks, and here in the 10-11 season, they ended up facing off against the Canucks in that third round. But before that, in the first round, they had faced off against the Kings, won in 6 games, 1 game in spectacular fashion. That third game of the series in which they took a 2-1 lead, they had been trailing 4-0 in that game before winning 6-5 in overtime. And of course, that iconic goal by Joe Thornton in Game 6 overtime against the Kings, in which he ends up sliding across the ice to center ice. I'm sure many people have seen that goal at this point if you are a Sharks fan. But then the Sharks would move on to face off against the Red Wings. They would almost get reversed sweeped by the Red Wings, but they would end up actually taking it in 7 games before they'd face off against an extremely good Canucks team, the only team ahead of the Sharks in the Western Conference. The Canucks had won the President's Trophy. They were very, very good that season, and it looked like the Canucks, at least going into the series, were the better team on most accounts. So most people were predicting the Canucks to win, but it was actually a pretty close series, even though it ended up ending in 5 games. It very well could have gone longer. The Sharks played the Canucks well. They were, very competitive, especially in that 5th game. It was unlucky that it ended on such a very, very unlucky goal for the Sharks that was scored by Kevin Bieksa in the double overtime. It's possible this series could have gone 6, maybe even 7 games. You play the series over and over again. Maybe the Canucks have the slight edge, but maybe just 6 times out of 10, let's just say. And so the Sharks, a very, very good team, but as I've said in the previous couple of years, as it was in 09-10, the Blackhawks were just a step ahead of the Sharks, and you could very well argue the Canucks were in a similar position, although by a smaller margin, I'd say. Now, for those of you who might not be keeping track, the top 2 seasons, of course, are the 15-16 season and the 18-19 season. And maybe controversially, I'll actually be putting the 15-16 season in second place. Now, that might be a bit strange to see because of the fact that this will be the only season on this board in which the Sharks actually managed to make it past the Western Conference Finals and into the Stanley Cup Finals. In the 15-16 season, they faced off against the Kings in the first round, won it decently easily. I wouldn't say it was so easy, but they exercised some demons there in 5 games against the Kings. They held out against the Predators, winning in 7 games, and took down a very tough Blues team in 6 games before they went to the Stanley Cup Finals and faced off against the Pittsburgh Penguins. But as I've said already multiple times this season, it was just another case in which the Penguins were a better team than the San Jose Sharks. You play that series multiple times over, and the Penguins probably win the majority of those times. It just seemed as though the Sharks were outmatched. Jones was very good in that series, and so it ended up going 6 games. But it's possible that it could have even gone less than that, even though there were some close calls in that series. So the fact of the matter is that the Sharks were very good that year, even after only placing 3rd in the regular season in the Pacific Division. But they just really weren't good enough, which is why it finds itself second on this list compared to what I have first, which is, of course, the 18-19 season. And maybe this is going to be a controversial statement, although maybe not the Sharks fans, but I would say if the Sharks had been fully healthy that year, so Shemek didn't get injured, Karlsson wasn't playing injured, Pavelski didn't get injured in the playoffs, I would make the argument that the Sharks were the best team in the league that season. Honestly, the only team who I was really afraid of going into the playoffs, had the Sharks been healthy, of course, were the Golden Knights that the Sharks actually faced in the first round. And even with, Karlsson playing injured and Shemek out, the Sharks actually managed to still take out the Golden Knights in that first round matchup. So I was very impressed with the Sharks there. And so while the Blues and the Bruins, the 2 teams that made it to the Stanley Cup Finals this year, were pretty remarkably healthy in the playoffs, so at least as far as we knew, the Sharks were not so much. And so, as I said, had they been healthy, I think they really could have made at least the Stanley Cup Finals. They I feel like they could have taken out the Blues and potentially even taken out the Bruins and really had their best chance in that 10-year period at a Stanley Cup Finals or at a Stanley Cup. And it's just so unfortunate that the injuries did end up hitting them at the worst time. So while the second season, the 15-16 season, they actually technically came the closest, I really believe that the 18-19 season was the Sharks' best team of the decade. But that will do it for this ranking. Of course, the Sharks right now, during this current season that is on pause, the Sharks have not been good, and some people are predicting that over the next couple of years, it could be a bit of a rocky set of seasons for the Sharks where they might not be making the playoffs. And it's unfortunate the Sharks fans will not be able to look back on this decade in which the Sharks had so many competitive teams, and they won't be able to look back on a Stanley Cup victory like how Blackhawks and Kings fans, who are currently watching their team play quite poorly but are able to look back on Stanley Cup victories are. However, it should be mentioned that the Sharks and Sharks fans have been quite spoiled during this past decade. They've been able to watch very, very competitive teams go deep into the playoffs, sometimes be playing late into May, and sometimes, as we know, into June as well. And there are likely over a couple dozen teams right now in the NHL who would have paid big money to be able to have even a fraction of the success that the Sharks have had during this past decade. You take a look at the Oilers, whose only playoff team that decade was that 16-17 season in which they lost in the second round. You take a look at a team like the Sabres, who have just been playing so poorly through the decade. You take a look at the Carolina Hurricanes, whose only playoff year was in the 18-19 season. So many teams would have liked to have similar success as the Sharks did. So while there's no Stanley Cup to look back on, it has been a pretty fun ride for us as Sharks fans, and hopefully we can get into another decade with similar success as this sooner rather than later. Class dismissed.